Hook. I never thought Grandma's obsession with gold would actually save my life. When everyone turned their back on me, her old gold account from 2000 became my only hope. She didn't just leave me gold, she left me a way out. Watch till the end. My wife and her boss took everything from me. The house. The business. $6.7 million. Even my kids. 3 months ago, I was on top of the world. Now I wake up in a one-bedroom apartment that smells like damp drywall and regret. Wondering how the hell it all fell apart. My name's Ethan Cole. I'm 42. Born and raised in Austin, Texas. I built my company, Cole Industrial Supply, from nothing but a pickup truck, a few loyal clients, and a stubborn refusal to quit. For 15 years I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. I started before dawn, finished after midnight. That grind bought me everything I thought mattered. A 6-bedroom house in the suburbs, a wife who once swore she'd follow me anywhere, 2 kids in college, a future that looked bulletproof. Olivia, my wife, was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make everyone look twice. Confident, polished, smart enough to make you feel like you were lucky just to stand beside her. When we met, she was a marketing assistant at a small agency, waiting tables at night to help pay off student loans. Back then, we were a team. We dreamed together, laughed about being broke, promised we'd never let success change who we were, but it did. Success has a way of shifting people, turning partners into strangers, somewhere between the new kitchen remodels, the country club brunches, and the endless charity events. Olivia started looking at me like I was a project she'd already finished. I didn't notice it at first. I was too busy keeping the business growing, chasing bigger contracts, hiring more people, paying college tuition for Jason and Chloe, our twins. Every time she said we needed to upgrade something, I said yes. I thought saying yes meant being a good husband. Turns out it just meant I was blind. Her boss, Marcus Trent, came into the picture about 2 years ago. He ran a construction conglomerate, the kind that builds half the skyline and brags about it on TV. He was older, mid-40s, smooth talker, the kind of guy who never had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. When Olivia mentioned him, she sounded impressed in a way that used to be reserved for me. I brushed it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. She was networking. She was building connections. That's what good marketers do. One night I came home from a job site around 11. Olivia was still dressed up. Makeup perfect. Perfume still fresh. She said she'd been at a client dinner with Marcus. She looked at her phone while she said it, her thumb hovering over a message she didn't send. That was the first time I felt it in my gut, that something was slipping beyond my reach. We stopped having dinners together. Our conversations became logistics bills, work schedules, college updates. She started going to more company retreats, staying overnight in Houston or Dallas. When I asked if we were okay, she smiled like I was a child who didn't understand how adult relationships worked. Ethan, we're just different people now, she said once, pouring wine into a glass like it was medicine. You care about pipes and numbers. I care about progress. I should have seen it then. The distance. The late-night phone calls. The way she laughed at Marcus's texts, louder than she ever laughed at my jokes. But I didn't. I kept my head down, convincing myself it was just a rough patch. The night everything cracked was our 20th anniversary. I left work early. Something I never do. I picked up a dozen roses. The good kind. The kind with the long stems and thorns that draw blood if you're careless. I even made a reservation at her favorite restaurant downtown. On the drive home, I practiced what I'd say. Maybe we could start over. Take a trip. Remember who we were before all the money. When I pulled into the driveway, Marcus's black Tesla was parked by the curb. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was business. Maybe they were going over a proposal. Maybe. I walked inside. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of laughter coming from upstairs. Not nervous laughter. Not guilty laughter. The kind of laughter two people share when they've stopped hiding a long time ago. I didn't go up. I stood there in the hallway holding those roses until the petals started to droop. Then I turned around. walked back to my truck, and sat there for 3 hours. I watched Marcus walk out around 6:30, buttoning his shirt, looking completely at home. He kissed her at my front door like he owned the place. She waved goodbye in the silk robe I bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to kick the door in, to make them both see what they'd done. But I didn't. I just stared until my vision blurred. At 8 o'clock I went back inside. The house smelled like her perfume and something sour underneath it. Olivia was cooking dinner, humming like nothing had happened. She turned and said, "You're late. Anniversary or not? You could have called." I dropped the flowers on the counter. Neither of us said another word. Later that night, I lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles. Every rotation felt like a countdown. Something inside me snapped, quietly, like a rope finally giving way under too much weight. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just knew the life I thought I had was over. The next morning, I went to work early. Before anyone else showed up, I sat in my office surrounded by the blueprints and contracts that used to mean everything. For the first time in years, I couldn't focus. My phone buzzed. An email from Olivia. The subject line read simply, "It's time." I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it said. When I finally opened the email, my hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. It was short, clinical, like something she'd copied from a lawyer's template. She wanted a divorce. She'd already filed the papers. She said it was for the best, that she hoped we could handle things like adults. At the bottom, she signed it Olivia Cole, not Liv, not the woman I used to know. That morning, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone at work. My foreman came in asking about a shipment delay. One of the drivers needed gas reimbursements, and I just nodded through it all like a ghost. Around 11, I finally stood up and walked outside. The air was sharp, cold for Texas, and I remember thinking how quiet it was. I'd built that company with my own 2 hands, and now it felt like I didn't belong there anymore. The divorce papers were served the next morning. I was in the middle of a team meeting when the door opened, and a man in a suit stepped in, asking for Ethan Cole. Everyone went silent. He handed me a thick envelope and left. No eye contact. No sympathy. Just another job for him. My project manager stared at me, waiting for some reaction. I forced a smile, told everyone to take a break, and went back to my office. I opened the envelope. The words blurred together. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Custody requests. Property division. Financial disclosure. I read until I saw the numbers and my breath caught. She was asking for everything. The house. The business. Full control of all joint accounts. Spousal support. Child support for Jason and Chloe, even though they were both 19 and in college. And attached to the file, a statement from her attorney, Marcus Trent. That name hit me like a punch. My wife's boss was her lawyer, or her lover acting as one. I didn't know which was worse. I called her. She didn't pick up. I texted her one word. Why? The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then nothing. By the end of the week, I had to hire my own attorney. The first 3 I called said they wouldn't take on Marcus Trent. Too powerful. Too connected. I finally found a small firm willing to represent me. A guy named Paul Simmons. Nice enough, but out of his depth. He warned me from the start. Marcus had money, influence, and friends in the courthouse. We'll fight it, Paul said. But prepare yourself. This won't be fair. The first hearing was brutal. Olivia sat across from me in a tailored suit I'd never seen before. Diamonds in her ears. Marcus sat beside her, whispering into her ear like a coach feeding lines to an actress. The judge, Collins, seemed half asleep until Marcus spoke, and then suddenly alert, nodding, agreeing, sustaining every objection against me. They painted me as a controlling husband, obsessed with work, emotionally distant, manipulative, with money. They had fake emails, edited text messages, even statements from country club friends saying I'd isolated her. When it was my turn to speak, I looked at Olivia. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I told the court I'd worked my entire life to give her and our kids stability, that I never raised my voice, never laid a hand on anyone, that I thought building a future together was love. The judge barely looked at me. He asked if I could produce financial statements. I said yes. Marcus smirked and said they'd already subpoenaed them. Every word I said felt smaller than the last. After that day, it stopped feeling like a marriage ending. It felt like a hostile takeover. Marcus filed motion after motion. He accused me of hiding assets, inflating expenses, even using the business for personal gain. Each accusation meant more paperwork, more legal fees. I started selling off tools. Then, equipment. Just to keep paying my lawyer. Within 2 months, I'd burned through almost everything I had. One night I drove past the house. The lights were on in the living room. Through the window I could see Marcus sitting on my couch with a drink in his hand, laughing. Olivia walked by in leggings and one of my old college shirts. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands cramped. I didn't knock. I just drove away. I think that was the moment I stopped recognizing my own life. The final hearing came 3 months later. Judge Collins read his decision like he was reciting the weather. Olivia was awarded the house. All marital assets, including the company. She would retain full custody of Jason and Chloe until they finished college. I was ordered to pay monthly support based on my previous income. Even though I no longer had a company to pay me, I tried to speak. But the judge cut me off. That will be all, Mr. Cole. Outside the courtroom, Olivia waited with Marcus. She smiled like she'd won an award. Marcus leaned close and whispered something that made her laugh. As I walked past, she said, "Sue me if you can. Ethan." Her voice was light, almost playful. "I'm untouchable." I wanted to tell her that being untouchable just meant she'd forgotten what it felt like to bleed. But I didn't. I walked out into the parking lot and kept walking until I reached my truck. I sat there for a long time, staring at the courthouse steps. The sound of traffic blending into a dull roar. The city felt too big, too loud, like I'd fallen out of rhythm with the world. By the time the sun went down, everything I'd worked for was gone. The bank accounts were frozen. The company was legally hers. My employees were told not to contact me. Even my own brother, who ran logistics for me, said Marcus had threatened to fire him if he stayed in touch. I rented a small apartment on the east side of town. The place smelled like mold and fried food from the restaurant below. I bought a used mattress and a coffee maker from a thrift shop. Every night I lay there, thinking about how fast a life can vanish. One day you're signing contracts worth millions. The next, you're counting dollars at a gas station. Jason stopped answering my calls. Chloe texted sometimes. Small things. Class updates. Questions about books. I didn't blame them. Their mother had shown them what she wanted them to believe. She was good at that. I told myself it didn't matter, that I just needed time. But time without purpose feels like a slow kind of death. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear Olivia breathing beside me. Instead, there was silence, heavy and endless. I'd get up, make coffee, stare out the window at the streetlights, and wonder how a man who spent 20 years building could lose everything in a heartbeat. That was my life now. The echo of something that used to matter. The sound of a door closing for good. The first month after the divorce felt like living underwater. Every sound was muffled. Every day blurred into the next. I'd wake up, make cheap coffee, sit by the window, and stare at the same cracked parking lot until the sun went down. I didn't speak to anyone except the cashier at the corner store and the landlord when the faucet leaked. It wasn't just losing Olivia or the money. It was losing the sense that my life had direction. Everything I'd done. All those years of waking up before dawn and staying late at the warehouse. Now felt like a joke only I hadn't caught. I picked up part-time work at a distribution warehouse across town. It paid barely enough to cover rent. The guys there didn't know who I was. And I didn't tell them. It was easier that way. Nobody asked questions. And nobody cared. Why a 42-year-old man with a college degree was lifting boxes for $12 an hour. My back ached every night. But at least the pain was proof I was still alive. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was the silence from my kids. Jason had blocked my number. Chloe would text once a week, short and polite, like she was talking to a stranger. I didn't blame them. Olivia had always been the storyteller in the family. And she'd spun her version of me long before I ever had a chance to defend myself. In her version, I was the villain who chose work over family, who made her feel invisible, who drove her into someone else's arms. Maybe it was easier for them to believe that than to face the truth. One night, after a long shift, I stopped by the diner near my building. It was half empty, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease. The waitress, a woman in her 50s named Carla, poured me a refill without asking. She didn't know my name, but she always called me sweetheart, like she did with everyone. I sat there staring at the steam rising from my mug, thinking about nothing and everything. A man at the counter was talking about gold prices, saying how they'd hit record highs. He mentioned the year 2000, how anyone who'd bought gold back then would be sitting on a fortune now. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that conversation stuck in the back of my mind like a splinter. That weekend, I decided to clean out my storage unit. It was a small space I'd rented years ago under my father's name, mostly filled with old tools and family boxes I hadn't touched since the move. I figured I could sell some things online, make a few extra bucks. The place smelled like dust and motor oil. I opened one box after another, most of it junk. My dad's old drill, a stack of invoices from the early days of the company, a few photo albums. Then, at the bottom of one box, under a pile of yellowed papers, I found a small wooden jewelry box I didn't recognize. Inside was a single key taped to a folded note. The handwriting was neat, the kind of cursive you don't see anymore. For Ethan, Bank of America, safe deposit box 3417, year 2000. My chest tightened. The signature at the bottom was faint but unmistakable. Grandma Eleanor. I sat on the concrete floor, holding that key like it was alive. I hadn't thought about her in years. She'd passed when I was in college. Before I met Olivia, I remembered her soft voice, the smell of lavender soap, how she used to say that banks were fine for loans, but not for trust. Keep something real. She used to tell me, money disappears, gold stays. I didn't even know she had a safe deposit box. Maybe it had been forgotten. Maybe it was empty. Still, something about finding that key felt like a thread being pulled loose in my chest. Like maybe there was still something left in the world that hadn't been taken from me. The next morning, I drove to the nearest Bank of America branch listed on the address. It was one of those glass buildings that looked too clean to be real. I walked inside wearing my work boots and a shirt with a tear in the sleeve. The young teller smiled politely until I slid the key across the counter and showed her the note. "I'd like to check on a safe deposit box," I said. "I believe it's been here since the year 2000. She typed something into her computer, then frowned. "One moment. Seer." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly before hanging up. "My manager will be right with you." A few minutes later, a man in a suit appeared, maybe in his 50s, with kind eyes and a cautious tone. "Mr. Cole, I'm Theodore Grayson, branch manager. Would you come with me? Please." We walked to his office. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. I tried to keep calm, telling myself this was probably routine. Maybe the box had been closed. Or maybe they'd lost the records. Theodore sat behind his desk, typed something into the system, and then stopped. His brow furrowed. He typed again. "This is unusual," he murmured, almost to himself. He turned the screen slightly away from me and picked up the phone again. "Patricia, could you bring the file for deposit box 3417? "Yes. That one. Thank you." Then he looked up. "Mr. Cole. This box was registered to Eleanor Cole in the year 2000. But there's also a beneficiary listed. That's you." I nodded slowly. "My grandmother. She passed away a long time ago." He gave a small smile. She must have been very forward-thinking. Most of these boxes get closed within a few years. But this one's been accruing fees that were automatically covered by a linked account. Remarkable. Really. Patricia, the teller, came in holding a thick binder. She whispered something to him, then set the binder down. I caught a glimpse of her face. She looked pale. Theodore flipped through the pages, then looked up at me. His voice suddenly careful. "Mr. Cole, This box hasn't been accessed in 25 years. I think it's best you see it yourself. He led me down a hallway to the vault. The air was colder down there. The lights hummed softly overhead. He unlocked the heavy door. And we stepped inside. The sound of metal echoed as he pulled out the small drawer labeled 3,417 and placed it on the table. "Whenever you're ready," he said, handing me a pair of gloves. My hands shook as I turned the key and lifted the lid. Inside was a smaller wooden case wrapped in linen. I opened it, half expecting to find old photos or letters. Instead, rows of gold bars gleamed under the fluorescent light. Small ones, about the size of a deck of cards, neatly stacked, each stamped with the year 2000 and the mark of the U.S. Mint. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Theodore leaned in, then stepped back, his eyes wide. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "with current prices, these are worth several $1,000,000. I couldn't speak. My grandmother, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived modestly her whole life, had left behind a treasure chest sitting untouched for a quarter century. My chest felt heavy, not with greed but with something deeper: gratitude, relief, and guilt, because part of me knew that if Olivia had found this during the divorce, she would have taken it too. I reached back into the box and found another envelope, yellowed and thin, my name written across it in her handwriting. For Ethan. I slipped it into my pocket, too overwhelmed to open it there. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt different, brighter, cleaner, alive in a way it hadn't in months. For the first time since losing everything, I wasn't empty. I was holding something that connected me to who I used to be, to the people who'd believed in me before I lost myself trying to prove my worth. I looked up at the sky, blinking against the sunlight, and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." I didn't know it yet, but that moment was the first crack in the wall that had kept me broken. That night I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope from the vault. The paper was thin and fragile, like it might crumble if I breathed too hard. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, rain tapped against the window, steady and calm. I opened the letter slowly, half afraid it would vanish if I rushed it. The handwriting was elegant, steady, exactly how I remembered it from birthday cards she used to send. "Ethan," it began, "if you are reading this, I'm long gone. But I hope life has treated you with both challenge and grace. If not, then maybe this will help. Gold does not change with time, but people do. Remember that wealth is not what you earn but what you keep safe. I bought this gold when I saw people losing faith in banks. You were still a boy. But I saw something in you. That restless need to build. Be careful, my dear. The world loves to take from men who build. Hide something for yourself. Something no one can touch. Love. Grandma Eleanor." I read it twice. By the end, my vision blurred. She had written those words 25 years ago. But somehow they fit my life perfectly. The world had taken everything I'd built, and here she was, saving me from beyond the grave. I spent the rest of the night at the kitchen table with a notepad, doing math in the margins like I used to when I started my business. The gold bars, about 80 of them, each weighing around 10 ounces, with prices hovering near $2,400 an ounce. The total came close to $19 million. I kept checking the numbers, thinking I'd misplaced a decimal, but every time I did, it came out the same. My grandmother's faith in something solid had just rewritten my future. The next morning I went back to the bank. Theodore greeted me with a handshake and a cautious smile. He asked if I wanted to transfer the gold to a secure account or keep it in the box. I told him I wanted to take inventory and move part of it to a private depository under my name. He nodded, understanding exactly what I was saying without me having to explain. He arranged for everything quietly. No paper trail that could lead to Olivia or Marcus. I signed what needed signing and thanked him. Before I left, he said something that stuck with me. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Cole. But more than that, you're a patient one. Not many people would still be standing after what you've been through." I smiled but didn't answer. Luck had nothing to do with it. Patience, Maybe. Pain. Definitely. For the first time in months, I felt awake. Not happy exactly, but alert. Like my mind had started turning again. I didn't rush into anything. I spent the next week working my shifts at the warehouse like nothing had changed. No one there knew I was sitting on a fortune, and I wanted to keep it that way. I'd already learned what happened when people saw what you had. They found ways to take it. At night, I researched investment law and asset protection. I learned how to transfer ownership through trusts, how to buy property through shell corporations, how to move quietly in a world that had once crushed me loudly. I set up a meeting with a financial advisor under a fake name, just to understand the legal landscape. Every step I took was small, deliberate. I was building a fortress this time, not a company. One evening, I was locking up at the warehouse when my phone buzzed. It was Chloe. My heart jumped. She hadn't called in months. I answered on the first ring. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Dad, Mom said you're still trying to fight the court's decision. Is that true?" I took a deep breath. "No. Sweetheart, I'm done fighting her way." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "She's different lately. Always nervous. Checking her phone. I think Marcus is in some kind of trouble." That got my attention. What kind of trouble? She hesitated. "I don't know. But if I were you, I'd be careful." We hung up after a few minutes. I sat in my truck, thinking about what she'd said. Marcus Trent, the man who had humiliated me, was the type who built empires on other people's backs. If he was nervous, it meant something was cracking. I didn't know what yet, but I planned to find out. The next morning, I drove to the business district and parked across from Trent Developments. The lobby was busy, full of suits and tablets. People moving like they had somewhere important to be. I watched Marcus walk in, flanked by two assistants, smiling like a man who owned the world. But I noticed something different. His smile was too tight, his eyes flicking toward every corner. He looked like a man expecting bad news. That same afternoon, I met with Daniel Brooks, an attorney recommended by Theodore. Daniel was older, sharp, and carried himself like someone who'd been in more courtrooms than he could count. When I explained my situation, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "Marcus Trent, I know the name. He's been on the SEC's radar for years. You might not have to lift a finger. Ethan, karma's already circling that man." I asked him to look into it anyway. Discreetly, he nodded. "We'll keep this quiet. In the meantime, keep your head down. Let them think you're broke." That became my mantra. Stay invisible. Move smart. Don't let emotion lead. Every time I thought about confronting Olivia, about telling her what I'd found, I'd hear my grandmother's voice. "The world loves to take from men who build. Hide something for yourself." A few nights later, I opened one of the gold bars and turned it over in my hands. It was heavier than it looked, solid and perfect. I remembered being a kid in her living room, watching her polish an old pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. She'd said, "Real things don't need to shout to be valuable. They just need time." Back then, I hadn't understood what she meant. Now I did. I decided to keep the discovery to myself. Not even Chloe would know. The fewer people aware, the safer it was. But I couldn't sit still anymore. I started tracking Marcus's public moves. His company was bidding for a massive city contract, one that could make or break him. If I played this right, I wouldn't just get justice. I'd get closure. A week later, Daniel called with an update. "You were right to be cautious. Marcus's financials are a mess. He's been moving money through shell companies tied to offshore accounts. If the feds catch wind of it, he's finished." I didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at the gold bar on my table. "Let's make sure they do," I said finally. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like it. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Olivia was probably sleeping in that big house, convinced she'd won. Marcus was probably dreaming of his next deal. And here I was, the man they thought they'd buried, quietly building something they couldn't see, something stronger than money, sharper than revenge. A plan. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel powerless. I felt patient. like gold waiting for the right moment to shine. The next few weeks moved slow, like the air before a storm. I kept my head down, went to work, came home, and watched the world from a distance. But underneath, something was shifting. The more Daniel uncovered about Marcus, the clearer it became that his empire was built on rotten ground, fraudulent contracts, offshore accounts, political bribes. He had his hands in everything, and if he fell, he'd take Olivia with him. Daniel was methodical. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was always worth listening. One afternoon, he called and said he wanted to meet at a diner near downtown. When I got there, he was already seated in a corner booth with a folder beside his coffee cup. He looked tired but focused. He slid the folder toward me. "You were right to trust your instincts. Marcus has been laundering money through subsidiaries under his wife's name and, get this, under Olivia's too. He thought he could hide his trail by spreading liability. But he got sloppy. I flipped through the papers. Bank statements. Shell corporations. False invoices. It was all there. The kind of evidence that could bury him. What happens if this goes public, I asked. Daniel sipped his coffee. The SEC will tear him apart. And if Olivia's tied to those accounts, she's done too. But we can't just dump this online. It needs to go through the right hands. He leaned closer. We'll need help from someone inside federal finance or tax enforcement. Someone clean. That night I sat in my apartment, staring at the gold bars lined up on the kitchen table. Each one gleamed under the fluorescent light, steady and silent. My grandmother's words kept echoing in my head. Hide something for yourself. I wasn't just hiding anymore. I was preparing. The gold had given me freedom. But what I wanted now was justice. The next morning, I visited Harper Lewis, a retired IRS investigator Daniel had recommended. Her office was a small rented space above a pawn shop. She greeted me with a firm handshake, sharp eyes, and a voice that didn't waste words. I read the file, she said, gesturing to the documents I'd sent ahead. If half of this is true, Marcus Trent is cooked. But he's powerful. And powerful men don't go quietly. You sure you want to poke this bear? I told her what he and Olivia had done, how they'd taken everything, humiliated me, left me with nothing. Her expression softened for the first time. Fair enough, she said. Let's make sure when he falls, he hits the ground hard. Over the next month, we built a case piece by piece. Harper had contacts in the Treasury Department who owed her favors. Daniel drafted formal reports that looked airtight. I handled logistics quietly, funding the operation with small gold sales converted into cash through discreet dealers. Every move was deliberate. No paper trails. No sudden spending. Olivia still believed I was broke. That illusion was my greatest weapon. One evening, Harper called. You might want to turn on Channel 7. I grabbed the remote. The evening news was covering an investigation into Trent developments. Words like financial misconduct and SEC inquiry flashed on the screen. Marcus's photo filled the frame. That same smug smile now frozen under the headline, Corporate Scandal Unfolds in Austin. I sat there, heart pounding. Harper's voice came through the phone. Calm and steady. It's starting. He's officially under federal review. For days, the story grew. Every channel, every website had his name. Stockholders panicked. Investors pulled out. Olivia was seen leaving their downtown office in tears. A week later, Chloe called. Dad. Mom's freaking out. Marcus hasn't been home in days. Reporters are camped outside. Did you know about this? Her voice trembled. I kept mine level. Sometimes people get what's coming to them. Sweetheart. She didn't answer for a moment, then whispered. You sound different. Stronger. Before she hung up, she said something that stuck with me. Grandma would be proud of you. I didn't feel proud. I felt something colder. Quieter. A sense of balance returning after years of chaos. But it wasn't over. Marcus still had influence. And men like him don't crumble overnight. I wanted to see it end completely. To know they couldn't crawl back. Daniel arranged a meeting with a contact from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We met in a small office building under the pretense of discussing business consulting. The agent, a woman named Karen Mitchell, read through the files and whistled softly. "This is solid," she said. "We've had eyes on Trent for months. But nothing this concrete. If these documents hold up, he's going to prison." When I left that meeting, the sun was setting, painting the skyline in gold and red. The air smelled like rain. I stopped by the river on the drive home, parked, and sat watching the water. For the first time, I let myself imagine what life could look like after this was over. Not rich or famous, just peaceful. Maybe rebuilding the company under a new name. Maybe teaching my kids something real about resilience. A few days later, the arrests came. Harper called me at dawn. "They got him," she said. "FBI raided his office this morning. They're taking boxes of documents. He's done." I turned on the news and saw Marcus being led out in handcuffs. The look on his face wasn't defiance. It was disbelief. For once, he wasn't in control. Later that afternoon, Olivia called. I didn't answer. She called again. And again. Finally, I picked up. Her voice was shaking. "Ethan, please. They froze my accounts. The house is under investigation. They're saying I could be charged too. You have to help me." I didn't know. I let the silence hang between us until she said, "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I took a deep breath. "No. Liv, I'm just finally breathing again." She started crying. Real tears this time. Not the kind she used to pull out in court. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked. "You figure it out," I said quietly. The same way I did. And then I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. Just empty. Like the space left behind after a storm. I looked at the small gold bar sitting on my desk and thought about my grandmother. About the way she'd prepared for a future she'd never see. She didn't leave me money. She left me patience. She left me a way to survive long enough for the truth to surface. That night I poured myself a drink, turned off the lights, and sat by the window. The city was quiet. The chaos outside my own little pocket of calm. Somewhere out there, Marcus was sitting in a holding cell. Olivia was learning what real consequences felt like. And my kids were finally starting to see through the lies. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I'd lost everything. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I'd found something worth keeping. The kind of wealth no one could steal. The next few weeks moved slow. Like the air before a storm. I kept my head down. Went to work. Came home. And watched the world from a distance. But underneath, something was shifting. The more Daniel uncovered about Marcus, the clearer it became that his empire was built on rotten ground. Fraudulent contracts. Offshore accounts. Political bribes. He had his hands in everything. And if he fell, he'd take Olivia with him. Daniel was methodical. He didn't talk much. But when he did, it was always worth listening. One afternoon, he called and said he wanted to meet at a diner near downtown. When I got there, he was already seated in a corner booth with a folder beside his coffee cup. He looked tired but focused. He slid the folder toward me. "You were right to trust your instincts. Marcus has been laundering money through subsidiaries under his wife's name and, get this, under Olivia's too. He thought he could hide his trail by spreading liability. But he got sloppy." I flipped through the papers. Bank statements. Shell corporations. False invoices. It was all there. The kind of evidence that could bury him. "What happens if this goes public?" I asked. Daniel sipped his coffee. "The SEC will tear him apart. And if Olivia's tied to those accounts, she's done too. But we can't just dump this online. It needs to go through the right hands." He leaned closer. "We'll need help from someone inside federal finance or tax enforcement. Someone clean." That night I sat in my apartment, staring at the gold bars lined up on the kitchen table. Each one gleamed under the fluorescent light. Steady and silent. My grandmother's words kept echoing in my head. "Hide something for yourself." I wasn't just hiding anymore. I was preparing. The gold had given me freedom. But what I wanted now was justice. The next morning, I visited Harper Lewis, a retired IRS investigator Daniel had recommended. Her office was a small rented space above a pawn shop. She greeted me with a firm handshake, sharp eyes, and a voice that didn't waste words. "I read the file," she said. gesturing to the documents I'd sent ahead. If half of this is true, Marcus Trent is cooked. But he's powerful. And powerful men don't go quietly. You sure you want to poke this bear? I told her what he and Olivia had done. How they'd taken everything. Humiliated me. Left me with nothing. Her expression softened for the first time. Fair enough, she said. Let's make sure when he falls, he hits the ground hard. Over the next month, we built a case piece by piece. Harper had contacts in the Treasury Department who owed her favors. Daniel drafted formal reports that looked airtight. I handled logistics quietly, funding the operation with small gold sales converted into cash through discreet dealers. Every move was deliberate. No paper trails. No sudden spending. Olivia still believed I was broke. That illusion was my greatest weapon. One evening, Harper called. You might want to turn on Channel 7. I grabbed the remote. The evening news was covering an investigation into Trent developments. Words like financial misconduct and SEC inquiry flashed on the screen. Marcus's photo filled the frame. That same smug smile now frozen under the headline, Corporate Scandal Unfolds in Austin. I sat there, heart pounding. Harper's voice came through the phone. Calm and steady. It's starting. He's officially under federal review. For days, the story grew. Every channel, every website had his name. Stockholders panicked. Investors pulled out. Olivia was seen leaving their downtown office in tears. A week later, Chloe called. Dad. Mom's freaking out. Marcus hasn't been home in days. Reporters are camped outside. Did you know about this? Her voice trembled. I kept mine level. Sometimes people get what's coming to them. Sweetheart. She didn't answer for a moment, then whispered, You sound different. Stronger. Before she hung up, she said something that stuck with me. Grandma would be proud of you. I didn't feel proud. I felt something colder. Quieter. A sense of balance returning after years of chaos. But it wasn't over. Marcus still had influence. And men like him don't crumble overnight. I wanted to see it end completely. To know they couldn't crawl back. Daniel arranged a meeting with a contact from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We met in a small office building, under the pretense of discussing business consulting. The agent, a woman named Karen Mitchell, read through the files and whistled softly. This is solid, she said. We've had eyes on Trent for months. But nothing. This concrete. If these documents hold up, he's going to prison. When I left that meeting, the sun was setting, painting the skyline in gold and red. The air smelled like rain. I stopped by the river on the drive home, parked, and sat watching the water. For the first time, I let myself imagine what life could look like after this was over. Not rich or famous, just peaceful. Maybe rebuilding the company under a new name. Maybe teaching my kids something real about resilience. A few days later, the arrests came. Harper called me at dawn. They got him, she said. FBI raided his office this morning. They're taking boxes of documents. He's done. I turned on the news and saw Marcus being led out in handcuffs. The look on his face wasn't defiance. It was disbelief. For once, he wasn't in control. Later that afternoon, Olivia called. I didn't answer. She called again. And again. Finally, I picked up. Her voice was shaking. Ethan. Please. They froze my accounts. The house is under investigation. They're saying I could be charged too. You have to help me. I didn't know. I let the silence hang between us until she said, You're enjoying this, aren't you? I took a deep breath. No. Liv. I'm just finally breathing again. She started crying. Real tears this time. Not the kind she used to pull out in court. What am I supposed to do? She asked. You figure it out, I said quietly. The same way I did. And then I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. Just empty. Like the space left behind after a storm. I looked at the small gold bar sitting on my desk and thought about my grandmother. About the way she'd prepared for a future she'd never see. She didn't leave me money. She left me patience. She left me a way to survive long enough for the truth to surface. That night I poured myself a drink, turned off the lights, and sat by the window. The city was quiet. The chaos outside my own little pocket of calm. Somewhere out there, Marcus was sitting in a holding cell. Olivia was learning what real consequences felt like. And my kids were finally starting to see through the lies. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I'd lost everything. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I'd found something worth keeping. The kind of wealth no one could steal. The next few weeks moved slow. Like the air before a storm, I kept my head down, went to work, came home, and watched the world from a distance. But underneath, something was shifting. The more Daniel uncovered about Marcus, the clearer it became that his empire was built on rotten ground. Fraudulent contracts, offshore accounts, political bribes. He had his hands in everything. And if he fell, he'd take Olivia with him. Daniel was methodical. He didn't talk much. But when he did, it was always worth listening. One afternoon, he called and said he wanted to meet at a diner near downtown. When I got there, he was already seated in a corner booth with a folder beside his coffee cup. He looked tired but focused. He slid the folder toward me. "You were right to trust your instincts. Marcus has been laundering money through subsidiaries under his wife's name and, get this, under Olivia's too. He thought he could hide his trail by spreading liability. But he got sloppy." I flipped through the papers. Bank statements, shell corporations, false invoices. It was all there. The kind of evidence that could bury him. "What happens if this goes public?" I asked. Daniel sipped his coffee. "The SEC will tear him apart. And if Olivia's tied to those accounts, she's done too. But we can't just dump this online. It needs to go through the right hands." He leaned closer. "We'll need help from someone inside federal finance or tax enforcement. Someone clean." That night I sat in my apartment, staring at the gold bars lined up on the kitchen table. Each one gleamed under the fluorescent light, steady and silent. My grandmother's words kept echoing in my head. "Hide something for yourself." I wasn't just hiding anymore. I was preparing. The gold had given me freedom. But what I wanted now was justice. The next morning, I visited Harper Lewis, a retired IRS investigator Daniel had recommended. Her office was a small rented space above a pawn shop. She greeted me with a firm handshake, sharp eyes, and a voice that didn't waste words. I read the file. She said, gesturing to the documents I'd sent ahead, "If half of this is true, Marcus Trent is cooked. But he's powerful. And powerful men don't go quietly. You sure you want to poke this bear?" I told her what he and Olivia had done, how they'd taken everything, humiliated me, left me with nothing. Her expression softened for the first time. "Fair enough," she said. "Let's make sure when he falls, he hits the ground hard." Over the next month, we built a case piece by piece. Harper had contacts in the Treasury Department who owed her favors. Daniel drafted formal reports that looked airtight. I handled logistics quietly, funding the operation with small gold sales converted into cash through discreet dealers. Every move was deliberate. No paper trails. No sudden spending. Olivia still believed I was broke. That illusion was my greatest weapon. One evening, Harper called. "You might want to turn on Channel 7. I grabbed the remote. The evening news was covering an investigation into Trent developments. Words like financial misconduct and SEC inquiry flashed on the screen. Marcus's photo filled the frame. That same smug smile now frozen under the headline, "Corporate Scandal Unfolds in Austin." I sat there, heart pounding. Harper's voice came through the phone, calm and steady. "It's starting. He's officially under federal review." For days, the story grew. Every channel, every website had his name. Stockholders panicked. Investors pulled out. Olivia was seen leaving their downtown office in tears. A week later, Chloe called. "Dad, Mom's freaking out. Marcus hasn't been home in days. Reporters are camped outside. Did you know about this?" Her voice trembled. I kept mine level. Sometimes people get what's coming to them. "Sweetheart." She didn't answer for a moment, then whispered, "You sound different, stronger." Before she hung up, she said something that stuck with me. "Grandma would be proud of you." I didn't feel proud. I felt something colder. Quieter. A sense of balance returning after years of chaos. But it wasn't over. Marcus still had influence. And men like him don't crumble overnight. I wanted to see it end completely. To know they couldn't crawl back. Daniel arranged a meeting with a contact from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We met in a small office building under the pretense of discussing business consulting. The agent, a woman named Karen Mitchell, read through the files and whistled softly. "This is solid," she said. "We've had eyes on Trent for months. But nothing this concrete. If these documents hold up, he's going to prison." When I left that meeting, the sun was setting, painting the skyline in gold and red. The air smelled like rain. I stopped by the river on the drive home, parked, and sat watching the water. For the first time, I let myself imagine what life could look like after this was over. Not rich or famous, just peaceful. Maybe rebuilding the company under a new name. Maybe teaching my kids something real about resilience. A few days later, the arrests came. Harper called me at dawn. "They got him," she said. "FBI raided his office this morning. They're taking boxes of documents. He's done." I turned on the news and saw Marcus being led out in handcuffs. The look on his face wasn't defiance. It was disbelief. For once, he wasn't in control. Later that afternoon, Olivia called. I didn't answer. She called again. And again. Finally, I picked up. Her voice was shaking. "Ethan, please." They froze my accounts. "The house is under investigation. They're saying I could be charged too. You have to help me." I didn't know. I let the silence hang between us until she said, "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I took a deep breath. "No. Liv. I'm just finally breathing again." She started crying. Real tears this time. Not the kind she used to pull out in court. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked. "You figure it out," I said quietly. The same way I did. And then I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. Just empty. Like the space left behind after a storm. I looked at the small gold bar sitting on my desk and thought about my grandmother. About the way she'd prepared for a future she'd never see. She didn't leave me money. She left me patience. She left me a way to survive long enough for the truth to surface. That night I poured myself a drink, turned off the lights, and sat by the window. The city was quiet. The chaos outside my own little pocket of calm. Somewhere out there, Marcus was sitting in a holding cell. Olivia was learning what real consequences felt like. And my kids were finally starting to see through the lies. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I'd lost everything. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I'd found something worth keeping. The kind of wealth no one could steal. The morning after the arrests, the city felt different. I walked outside and the air was sharp, clean. Like something toxic had finally lifted. For the first time in a long time. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like a man who'd been beaten. I felt like a man who had survived. News of Marcus's downfall spread fast. Every major outlet ran the story. Corporate fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. His mugshot was everywhere. Olivia's name appeared too, though buried deeper in the articles. Mentioned as a possible co-conspirator. The same woman who once bragged about being untouchable was suddenly silent. I didn't need to see her face to know how that silence felt. Daniel called that afternoon. He sounded almost cheerful. "Congratulations, Ethan. The feds are taking this case seriously. Marcus is facing a laundry list of charges. And your ex-wife's accounts are under review. Looks like the tables finally turned." I thanked him. Though the word felt too small. He told me to stay low. Not to get involved. Not to speak to the press. They'll sniff around. But let them. You've done your part. I spent the next few days quietly watching it unfold. Reporters hounded Marcus's former employees. His company's stock tanked. His board of directors issued a public statement distancing themselves from him. The empire he'd built, the one he'd used to destroy me, was collapsing brick by brick, and all I had to do was wait. Chloe came to see me a week later. She knocked on my apartment door wearing a college sweatshirt and holding 2 coffees. I hadn't seen her since the divorce hearing. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she smiled. Nervous but real. "You look better, Dad," she said. Lighter somehow. I laughed quietly. Guess losing everything can do that. We sat by the window. watching the traffic. She told me Olivia had moved out of the house after the bank froze her assets. She's staying with Aunt Carol, Chloe said softly. She keeps saying she didn't know what Marcus was doing. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence said enough. Chloe took a sip of her coffee and looked at me. Mom's scared, she said. But I think she's more scared of you. That surprised me. Why would she be scared of me? Chloe shrugged. Because you didn't break. People expect you to stay down after they knock you over. You didn't. After she left, I sat in that same chair long after the sun went down. Her words echoed in my head. You didn't break. I thought about my grandmother again. How she'd lived through recessions, wars, and loss, yet never lost her calm. Maybe resilience skips a generation and lands when it's needed most. The next week, Harper called with new information. Ethan, you should hear this from me. Marcus is cutting a deal. He's naming names to reduce his sentence. And Olivia's one of them. My stomach tightened. What does that mean for her? Harper sighed. It means she's looking at potential charges unless she cooperates too. But there's more. He admitted to bribing Judge Collins during your divorce case. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Then it hit me like a slow wave. Every unfair ruling, every smirk on that judge's face, every time I'd been told I was overreacting, it hadn't been paranoia. It had been corruption. Can that help me? I asked quietly. Harper's tone sharpened. More than help you. It could overturn everything, but you have to decide what you want. Revenge or closure? I didn't answer her right away. That night, I walked through downtown Austin, passing restaurants where Olivia and I used to eat, buildings where I'd made deals. The city looked the same, but I wasn't. I'd spent months thinking revenge would fix me, that payback would somehow fill the hole they'd left. But standing there, I realized revenge was just a doorway. What came after mattered more. The next day, I met Daniel and Harper in his office. The walls were lined with law books and certificates, all symbols of order I no longer trusted. Daniel laid out the documents. Here's what we have: proof of bribery, falsified evidence, and financial fraud during your divorce. We can file for full reversal. You'll get the business back. The house. Everything that was taken. Legally. I looked down at the papers. My name. Her name. The signatures that had cost me everything. And Olivia, I asked. If we file this, she'll be forced to testify. She'll either tell the truth or go down with him. Harper said. I signed the paperwork without hesitation. 2 weeks later, federal investigators announced additional arrests tied to the case. Judge Collins was taken into custody for bribery and obstruction of justice. Olivia was subpoenaed. The news outlets devoured the story. Corruption scandal expands. High-profile divorce case overturned. My phone buzzed with messages from old colleagues, old friends, people who'd avoided me when I was down. I ignored them all. Then, one night, Olivia showed up at my door. She looked smaller somehow. Her confidence gone. She asked if she could come in. I stepped aside. She sat at the table, hands shaking, eyes red. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know what Marcus was doing at first. And when I did, it was too late. He said he'd ruin me if I left. I listened. But the words felt empty. You still ruined me, I said. You stood next to him while he did it. She nodded, tears falling. I know. I'll live with that. She looked around the small apartment, her voice breaking. You really were the better one. Ethan. I just didn't see it until now. I didn't say I forgave her. I didn't feel hate either. Just distance. Like she was a memory that no longer hurt. She stood to leave but paused at the door. I hope you find peace, she said quietly. You deserve it. When she left, I felt lighter. Like the last tie to my old life had finally snapped. A month later, the court ruled in my favor. The divorce judgment was overturned. All assets wrongfully seized were restored. The house, the company, the accounts. But I didn't want most of it back. I sold the house immediately and transferred the company to my former employees under a profit-sharing model. I didn't need to rebuild what was already ashes. I wanted something cleaner, simpler, real. Chloe visited again when the news broke. We sat on the porch of my new rental, a small house by the lake. She asked what I was going to do next. I smiled. I think I've had enough of building things for a while. Maybe it's time to build people. She looked confused, then smiled back. Grandma would like that. That night, I took one of the smaller gold bars from the safe and placed it on the windowsill. The moonlight hit it perfectly, turning it into something more than metal. It wasn't just a fortune. It was a lesson. Real value doesn't fade when everything else falls apart. It waits, quietly, until you're ready to see it. Outside, the lake shimmered under the night sky. Somewhere far away, the sound of sirens echoed faintly. Maybe they were for someone else this time. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the quiet settle in. For the first time since it all began, silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I woke up early that morning, the kind of early where the world is still half asleep. The air outside was cool, the sky pale and quiet. For once, there wasn't a weight pressing on my chest. The news had settled. The noise had died down, and I was finally alone with the aftermath. But peace is a strange thing. When you've lived in chaos long enough, silence starts to feel suspicious. Daniel called just after sunrise. His voice was steady, but I could hear something behind it. A mix of excitement and exhaustion. He told me the federal trial date for Marcus was set, that Olivia had taken a plea deal to avoid charges, and that Judge Collins had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. "You're officially in the clear, Ethan," he said. "Completely." I thanked him, but the words felt hollow. The fight was over. But closure didn't come with a gavel. It came slow, in pieces, like fog lifting. Later that day, I met Chloe for lunch at a small diner near the lake. She ordered pancakes and coffee like she used to when she was a kid. I watched her stir sugar into her cup, her movements calm, deliberate. "Jason wants to see you," she said suddenly. "He's been quiet, but he knows everything now. About Mom. Marcus. All of it." I took a breath, unsure how to react. "Does he hate me less?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "He never hated you, Dad. He just believed the wrong story." That afternoon, Jason showed up at my door. He looked older, heavier in the shoulders. A man now instead of the boy I'd last seen glaring at me in court. We stood there awkwardly for a second before he reached out and hugged me. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. I felt my throat tighten. I didn't realize how much I'd needed to hear it until that moment. We sat outside, watching the water. He told me he'd dropped out of college for a semester to help Chloe get Mom settled somewhere safe. "She's not doing great," he said. "She's embarrassed. People talk. The country club revoked her membership." I almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, but irony. The place she'd worshipped most had turned its back on her faster than I ever could. She made her choices, I said quietly. He nodded. "Yeah. I just thought you should know." We sat there a long time, not saying much. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was real. Over the next few weeks, I found myself falling into a rhythm again. I started running in the mornings, drinking coffee on the porch, reading books that had sat unopened for years. I met with Daniel about finalizing the last of the settlements, but I told him I didn't want to rebuild coal industrial supply. That chapter was done. He asked what I planned to do instead. I told him I wasn't sure yet. Maybe something that didn't involve lawyers or contracts. Maybe something simple. He grinned. "Simple sounds nice. You've earned that." Harper stopped by one evening with a folder in hand. "I thought you might want to see this," she said. Inside were photos from the courthouse. Marcus in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, head down. The media had been relentless. Every headline carried words like disgraced, guilty, sentenced. He got 8 years. Harper said, "He'll probably serve 6 if he behaves." I studied the photo for a long time. The man who'd once stood in my house, smirking, had vanished. What was left looked hollow, defeated. "You did good work," I told her. She smiled, then added, "You did most of it yourself. I just helped connect the dots." After she left, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window. Outside, The streetlights flickered on one by one. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to go wrong. I was just living again. A few days later, I drove to the old neighborhood where my house used to be. A new family had moved in. Kids' bikes lined the driveway. Chalk drawings on the sidewalk. I parked across the street and watched for a while. A little girl ran through the sprinkler, laughing. Her parents clapping from the porch. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt relief. That house had seen too much ugliness. It deserved laughter again. Back home, I opened the safe and took out one of the gold bars. I hadn't touched them in weeks. I ran my thumb over the stamped date, 2000, and thought about how much had changed since then. My grandmother had bought those bars during a time when people were scared of losing everything. Maybe she'd known one day her grandson would need them for the same reason. I drove out to the cemetery the next morning. Her grave was simple. A small stone beneath an oak tree. I brought one gold bar wrapped in cloth and placed it beside the headstone. "You saved me, Grandma," I said quietly, more than once. I stood there for a long time, thinking about the weight of things, how real value doesn't shine until the world goes dark. Then I walked away, leaving that single bar behind like a thank you. When I got home, the answering machine was blinking. A message from Olivia. Her voice was shaky. "Lo, I heard you went to see your grandmother," she said. "I wanted to say thank you. Not for helping me, but for not destroying me when you could have. You were right. Ethan, I did ruin us, and I can't fix it." There was a pause. Then, "Take care of the kids." The line went dead. I didn't call back. There was nothing left to say. She was living with her sister now, working part-time at a dental office again. The woman who once measured her worth by what she owned had finally learned how fragile it all was. Maybe that was enough punishment. That night, Jason and Chloe came over for dinner. I cooked for the first time in months. We ate, laughed, told stories about Grandma Eleanor. And for a few hours, it felt like we'd finally stepped out of the wreckage. After they left, I sat on the porch listening to the crickets. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, and I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the loss, the quiet revenge that had brought it all full circle. I poured another drink and smiled to myself. I wasn't rich in the way I used to be, but I was whole. And sometimes, that's the kind of wealth that matters most. The morning after that dinner, I woke up before the sun. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels full instead of empty. I made coffee and sat on the porch watching the light change over the lake. For months I'd been living like a man who'd survived a crash, checking for damage that wasn't there anymore. Now it finally felt like I could breathe without waiting for the next hit. A few days later, Daniel called. His tone was lighter than I'd ever heard it. He said the final paperwork had gone through. The courts had closed the case completely. The assets were officially back in my name. And the investigation into Marcus and Judge Collins was finished. "You're a free man, Ethan," he said. "Legally, financially, completely." I thanked him. And this time I meant it. He told me he was taking a vacation for the first time in 10 years. I told him he'd earned it. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. Free. The word didn't sound like it used to. It wasn't about money or houses or cars anymore. It was about waking up in the morning and not feeling owned by anyone or anything. That afternoon I met with Chloe at a coffee shop near the university. She had that same spark in her eyes she used to have as a kid. The one that reminded me of her grandmother. She told me Jason had re-enrolled in college. That they were both doing better. "You should come to Mom's next week," she said carefully. "She wants to apologize in person." I hesitated, stirring my coffee. "I don't think she owes me that anymore," I said. Chloe smiled softly. "Maybe not, but maybe you need to hear it anyway." I went. Olivia was living in a modest townhouse on the north side of Austin, far from the mansions and golf courses she used to love. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. No designer clothes. No polished smile. Just a tired woman trying to start over. She invited me in. Offered me tea. The air was tense at first. But then she sat across from me and said what she needed to say. "I lost everything, Ethan, she said. Not just the money, the respect. The people who used to pretend to like me. When it all disappeared, I realized I didn't even like myself anymore. I wanted to blame Marcus. But the truth is, I let it happen. I helped him destroy the one good thing I had. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. She looked down at her hands, twisting a cheap silver ring. When the reporters came, when they dug through everything, I kept thinking about the day you left the courtroom. You didn't yell. You didn't fight. You just walked away. I thought that meant you were weak. Now I know it meant you were strong. I nodded slowly. We were both different people then. I said, maybe that's the only way it could have gone. She looked up, her eyes wet but steady. Do you hate me? I shook my head. No. I stopped carrying that a while ago. It's too heavy. She smiled. The kind of small, broken smile that comes from someone finally understanding their own mistakes. Before I left, she said she was applying for a teaching certificate, trying to start a new career. Maybe I'll do some good this time, she said. I told her I hoped she would. Driving home, I didn't feel anger or relief, just peace. It was strange how forgiving someone else could feel like forgiving yourself, too. That night, I called Harper to check in. She told me Marcus had been transferred to a low-security federal facility out of state, where he'd spend the next 6 years. He's been trying to appeal, but there's not much left to appeal, she said. He's lucky to have gotten off with that. I thanked her for everything. She laughed and said, don't thank me. You're the one who held the line. A few weeks later, I sold what was left of the gold. Not all of it. Just enough to create something new. I started the Eleanor Foundation, named after my grandmother. It focused on teaching financial literacy to working families, helping them understand the basics of saving, investing, and building real security. I used part of the money to fund community programs around Austin. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. At first, I thought I'd feel out of place talking to people about money again. But it was different this time. There were no contracts, no deals, no competition, just people trying to build something steady for their families. Every time I stood in front of a group, I thought about my grandmother sitting at her kitchen table, rolling coins into paper sleeves, saying, save something that time can't steal. One evening, after a class, Jason and Chloe came to visit the foundation's small office. Jason looked around at the shelves of books and the photos on the wall. You did all this, he asked. I nodded. With Grandma's help? Chloe smiled. She'd be proud. She always believed in you. After they left, I turned off the lights and stood in the quiet room. There was a framed photograph of my grandmother on the wall, next to one of the gold bars I'd kept. I ran my hand over the frame. I could almost hear her voice in my head. Be patient. Time makes everything clearer. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Cars passed. People laughed. And for the first time, it didn't feel like the world was moving without me. I was part of it again, but on my own terms. A month later, I received a letter from the Department of Justice. It was official confirmation that all charges against me from the original divorce case had been expunged. My record was clean. I folded the paper neatly and placed it in the same drawer as my grandmother's letter. Different ink, same meaning. Freedom. That night, I walked down to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the stars like a sheet of glass. I skipped a stone across it and watched the ripples fade. Everything that had once felt like the end now looked like the beginning. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been. The husband, the businessman, the man who'd lost everything, the man who'd rebuilt quietly. Each one had left something behind. But this version, the one standing there by the water, finally felt like home. When I turned back toward the house, the porch light flickered on automatically. It made me smile. Some things, it seemed, could still surprise me in good ways. The next morning the light came through the blinds in soft stripes, warm and golden. I made coffee and sat by the window watching the lake ripple in the breeze. It was quiet. Just the sound of water against the shore and the hum of cicadas waking up, for the first time in years. The silence didn't feel like something I needed to fill. It just felt like peace. Chloe stopped by later that afternoon. She brought groceries and a stack of papers from the foundation office. We worked side by side in the kitchen, cooking dinner, laughing about how bad we both were at chopping onions. She told me she had been accepted into a graduate program for social work. Jason had decided to join the foundation full-time. Hearing that made me prouder than any business contract ever had. "You built something real, Dad," she said. "Not just for us, but for a lot of people." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. After dinner, they both left, and I stayed outside watching the sunset. The sky turned that deep orange that makes everything look softer. The air smelled like rain again. I found myself thinking about all the pieces of my life that had led here. Losing the company, losing my marriage, losing faith, and how, in some strange way, all of it had cleared the space for something better. That night I opened the old wooden box I kept under my bed. Inside were the letters from my grandmother, her pocket watch, and the last small gold bar I had saved. I picked it up and felt its weight. It wasn't just metal anymore. It was memory. It was her hand on my shoulder every time life tried to knock me down. It was proof that sometimes the people who came before us leave more than money. They leave wisdom wrapped in time. I thought about visiting her grave again. Maybe bringing Jason and Chloe this time. They deserved to know the full story. Not just the headlines and the losses, but the lessons, the patience, the faith, the quiet endurance that had carried both her and me through storms. Maybe one day they would pass that same strength to their own kids. A week later, the foundation hosted its first major seminar. We rented a small community center on the east side of town. Dozens of people showed up. Families, young couples, older workers who had never trusted banks but wanted to learn how to save. I walked to the front of the room, looked at all those faces, and felt something settle inside me. I told them about compound interest, about steady investment, about not chasing what shines too fast. But then I told them a different kind of story, about a woman who didn't trust the system, who believed in saving something real, about how her quiet foresight changed everything for her grandson decades later. I didn't say her name, but I didn't need to. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Some were smiling, some were crying, all of them were listening. After the seminar, a young man came up to me and said he'd grown up thinking people like him would never have enough to invest in anything. He said hearing my story made him believe he could start small, that maybe one day he could build something that would outlast him. I shook his hand and told him the truth. That's all any of us can do. I said, build something that lasts. When I got home that night, I turned off the lights and stood by the window again. The moonlight hit the water, the same way it had on the night I found my grandmother's letter. I thought about Olivia, wherever she was, rebuilding her life in her own quiet way. I thought about Marcus in his cell, probably still believing he'd find a way to win. And I thought about the man I used to be, the one who thought money and success could protect him from heartbreak. I almost didn't recognize him anymore. The truth is, what my grandmother left me wasn't just gold. It was time. Time to fall apart. To learn. To rebuild. Time to see that real wealth doesn't come from what you own. It comes from what you survive. I sat back down at the table, poured myself a small drink, and opened the window to let in the night air. The sound of the lake filled the room, calm and endless. Somewhere in the distance, I heard laughter from a nearby dock. It made me smile. I picked up her letter one last time, read the faded words, and whispered a quiet thank you. Then I folded it carefully, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. Maybe this was what she meant all along. That patience is its own kind of fortune. That silence can be power. That when everything is stripped away, what's left is who you really are. If you've made it this far, maybe you've been through your own kind of storm. Maybe someone's taken more from you than you thought you could lose. But if my story taught me anything, it's this. Life has a way of circling back. Sometimes the things buried longest end up saving you when you least expect it. Stay patient. Stay standing. And when it's your turn to rise, do it quietly, but do it completely. If this story hits somewhere deep, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And stick around, because sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud. It's living long enough to see the truth shine.